The snow fell in thick curtains over the railway platform as Margaret Ashford stood waiting, her hands trembling inside her fur-lined gloves. It wasn't the cold that made her shake. After 3 years of mourning her late husband, she had finally agreed to her brother's persistent urging to consider remarriage through the Western Matrimonial Agency. The letters had been thoughtful, intelligent, filled with observations about literature and philosophy that had stirred something she thought had died with Charles. But when the train's brakes screeched and the passengers began to disembark, Margaret's breath caught in her throat for an entirely different reason. Among the crowd emerged a man in a brown coat, his face matching the photograph she clutched in her pocket, but he sat in a wooden wheelchair, pushed by a porter. Thomas Whitmore's eyes scanned the platform until they found hers. And in that instant, she saw hope flicker across his features before her expression betrayed her shock. The other passengers whispered and stared, their judgment hanging in the frozen air like the steam from the locomotive. Margaret felt the weight of every eye upon them both, and shame burned through her not for him, but for the instinct that made her want to turn and flee. Thomas dismissed the porter with quiet dignity and wheeled himself toward her, his strong arms moving with practiced efficiency. When he stopped before her, he didn't offer excuses or explanations. Instead, he simply said, "Mrs. Ashford, I apologize for the deception in omitting this detail from my letters. I understand if you wish to refuse our arrangement. I can return on tomorrow's train." His voice was steady, but Margaret heard the resignation beneath it, the tone of a man who had faced rejection so many times it had become routine. Before she could respond, her brother William appeared, his face darkening with anger. "This is outrageous." "The agency assured us," Thomas interrupted gently. "The agency knows nothing of my condition. I chose not to disclose it. The fault is entirely mine." He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. "I've saved enough for my return fare, and to compensate for any inconvenience." Margaret stared at this man who wrote so beautifully about Wordsworth's poetry, who had corresponded with her about the proper cultivation of roses and the education of children. In his letters he had been whole, vibrant, full of dreams for building a future. Now she understood why those dreams had seemed so carefully constructed, so deliberately planned. Because Thomas Whitmore had learned that life required twice the determination when the world saw you as half a man. William snatched the envelope. "Damned right you'll compensate. Coming all this way under false pretenses. William." "Enough." Margaret's voice cut through the cold air with surprising authority. She stepped closer to Thomas, close enough to see the steel in his gray eyes, the strength in his shoulders, the calluses on his hands, from years of propelling himself through a world built for others. "Mr. Whitmore, do you still wish to honor our agreement?" Thomas studied her face, searching for pity or obligation. Finding neither, he answered carefully, "I do, if you'll have me. Mrs. Ashford, I may not walk, but I can work. I can think. I can care for a home and family. I can be a husband in every way that matters." Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, like ice breaking after a long winter. "Then we proceed as planned. William, please arrange for Mr. Whitmore's belongings to be brought to the house." As her brother sputtered in protest, Margaret extended her hand to Thomas, not in pity but in partnership. And when he took it, she felt the strength there and knew that this man in a wheelchair might just be strong enough to help her walk again too. The first weeks were harder than either of them anticipated. The house staff whispered in corners, and the neighbors' visits became thinly veiled opportunities to gossip about Margaret's peculiar choice. Thomas insisted on earning his place, refusing to be treated as an invalid or a charity case. He rose before dawn, managing the household accounts with meticulous precision, reorganizing the library, and overseeing repairs to the property with an engineer's eye for detail. Margaret watched him navigate a world designed to exclude him. His wheelchair an obstacle he refused to let define his limitations. When the stable master dismissed his suggestions for improving the horse enclosures, Thomas simply drafted detailed plans and left them on Margaret's desk. She implemented every one, and within a month, the horses were healthier and the operation more efficient. When her brother arrived one afternoon with a lawyer, insisting she have the marriage annulled before it was consummated, Margaret met them in the study where Thomas sat reviewing contracts for spring planting. "He's made you a laughingstock, Margaret," William hissed. "People are calling you the woman who married a cripple out of Desperation. Thomas began to wheel himself toward the door, but Margaret's voice stopped him. Stay, Thomas. This concerns you too. She turned to her brother with eyes like flint. You want to know what Thomas has done in 3 weeks? He's increased our household efficiency by 30%, identified a fraudulent grain supplier who was overcharging us, designed a new irrigation system for the fields, and taught me that I've been living half a life. Afraid to hope for anything beyond mere existence, she walked to Thomas's chair and placed her hand on his shoulder. He's also been kinder to me than any fully able-bodied man ever was, including my first husband. God rest his soul. William's face purpled. He can't even stand beside you like a proper husband. How will we what, William? Margaret's voice was ice. Build a life? We already are. Have children? That's our business, not yours. Be happy. I am closer to it now than I've been in years. The lawyer cleared his throat uncomfortably. Mrs. Ashford, perhaps you're not thinking clearly about the practicalities. Thomas spoke then, his voice quiet but firm. What practicalities? That I cannot dance with my wife at balls? I can still hold her hand during a concert? That I cannot walk beside her in the garden? I can still meet her there and appreciate the roses she cultivates? That I cannot climb stairs? Then we make our life on the ground floor, or I grow strong enough to manage them as I've managed everything else the world said I couldn't do. He looked up at Margaret, and she saw in his eyes something she'd stopped believing in. Genuine partnership. I may sit while others stand, but I refuse to be a man who sits idle while others live. After William and the lawyer left in frustrated defeat, Margaret knelt beside Thomas's chair. You know they'll never stop talking. Never stop judging. Let them talk, Thomas said, taking her hand. I spent years being rejected for what I couldn't do. You're the first person who saw what I could. That's worth more than 1,000 opinions, from people who measure a man's worth by the height at which he stands rather than the strength of his character. Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. I was so afraid when I saw you on that platform. Not of you, but of what others would think, what they would say. I'm ashamed of that moment. Don't be, Thomas said gently. You were honest in your shock, but you chose courage in your response. That's what defines us, not our first reaction, but what we do next. 6 months later, when Margaret announced she was with child, the whispers finally began to quiet, not because Thomas had somehow become what society expected, but because Margaret and Thomas had built something undeniable, a partnership of equals where worth was, measured not in physical ability but in devotion, intelligence, and unwavering commitment to each other's happiness. The man the world had rejected as disabled had taught an entire town that the real disability was in their inability to see beyond the surface to the extraordinary strength beneath. Dear viewers, if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel.